in reality, there were many people who were Hafiz of Quran, who had memorized the whole Quran by heart. And there are a number of artifacts existing of one where the whole Quran was written. As we know of one case in Jamaica, and there was also a case over here. And then there were other of parts of Quran being written. You know, I know of a case in Bahamas where they found scripts of, you know, like maybe a whole surah, Fatiha or some surah and stuff written and stuff. They have these as artifacts that were written by slaves, by people who were in slavery. So we know that many of them were Muslims and they practice, you know, and it's written down, many of them, you know, that historically show that there were Muslims in the area. Also, like for instance, in Guyana, you know, that you find that the Fola was more people from the Fola tribe, Fulani tribe was more for Guyana, where like Trinidad and Jamaica, you find a lot of the Mandingos from the Mandi tribes, you know, there. So that is the second wave of Muslims that came into the area. The third wave of Muslims that came into the area, you know, from at least from south, and then they moved north. Many of them moved north after coming to the south. Many of them was after the period of slavery and during the period of indentureship. During this period of indentureship population, where the British and the Dutch and these European powers, they went to and they bought people from India and from Indonesia and places like that, that they bought them as indentured servants to replace the slaves in the African slaves in the Caribbean area and Central American area. You find that. So, like for instance, like Guyana and Suriname. And St. Vincent in Jamaica and all those areas, you find that a lot of those indentured people came in. There was, we don't know the ratio of Muslim and Hindu that was bought. I'm not sure the ratio, but I know that there was a significant population of Muslims among those, that because it was from both Hindu and Muslims that came, that were bought from India and the Dutch Muslims to this part of the world. So they were the third wave, I'll say, that came in that came into the area, and they were not slaves. They came in as pseudo slaves. They call them indentured laborers, where they committed for a period of their life to work as slaves on the plantation, and after that time is up, they're free to go home, or they can stay and they would give them land and stuff like that, whatever it was. So this is how it happened, you know. So like in the Caribbean area, for instance, many of them came and they maintained the religion. Many of them maintained the religion because they were not like the African people, like our people, they're forced to give up everything, their names and their culture and their religion and everything like that. No, and their language and so on. No, and their families destroyed and stuff. They were not required to do that, and so they were able to maintain their religion. So they have to build religious centers and stuff like that. You know, Hindus build temples and what have you. But Muslims were able to build masjids in Guyana. You have over 100 and somebody Muslim masjids right across Guyana and in Suriname. You know, those Muslims from the Javanese background, you know, built a lot of masjids. They built masjids there also, and so on. But we know that they kept whatever tradition that they were able to keep the, you know, of them, because they were not scholars, but they were able to keep a lot of their some of their traditions and stuff like that. Actually, in the early stages, you know, when the Muslims, now we know that the connection, we can see the actual connection. Like when I went to Guyana, when I went to Guyana back in the late 70s, I moved to Guyana to teach there. And Muslims, which was now predominantly mainly Indo-Pak Muslims Indo-Pak background, Indian origin, they were called Fuller Man. They called them Fuller Man. It was a nickname that the Hindus would call the Muslims Fuller Man. We know, of course, that there's no connection between Fuller and India, but Fuller is connected to Africa. But because the early Muslims that were there were from Fuller tribe, and they identified the Muslims now come in and they identified the same religion, they used to call the Muslims Fuller Man. All right, so that's how the name Fuller Man got for the Muslims in Guyana, even though they were from India and not from Africa, you know, because of the connection to the African connection. So this, you know, event, you know, in Guyana, as I said, I mean, Trinidad was the Mandinka, you know, they call them Mandinkas, you know, and so on. Even in Jamaica, you have like the Maroons, which were slaves that people who refused to be dominated and ruled slaves. They ran away into the mountains and they fought the British over and over and over, and the British then made a deal with them, you know, and made an agreement with them so that they left them free in the mountains, but they're not allowed to allow any of the other slaves to come and join them. Stuff. So the Maroons still there. The Maroons are still there in Jamaica, and they had a lot of traditions, Islamic, a lot of Muslim tradition that still remained with them. They were able to keep, you know, like Fatiha and some of that. They still had places where they called the Juma hole, where they used to go and bathe to prepare for Juma and stuff like that. You know, there's when you study the history in Jamaica over there, that wave that came. There are two waves that came to North America. There is, you know, the Islam in North America now, you know, in the Caribbean it grew, of course, and spread. And it extended from south to north, right? Extended from, so you have a lot of Muslims from the Caribbean area that migrated north to North America, and they brought Islam with them. There's also the migration that started back in the 70s from Muslim countries, Indo-Pak and Arab, that came in during the 70s. Prior to that, there were Muslims from the diaspora, the African diaspora, who, you know, free from the period from the slavery background, who had started coming back to Islam. So there was a growing movement. There were actually two main branches of movement here in North America. There was the Nation of Islam, which was founded and run by Elijah Muhammad, and then there was the Sunni Muslim movement, the Orthodox Muslim movement, where they were, you know, they believed in the Quran and then the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of Allah upon him. They followed traditional Islam. So there were two groups that was there. Of course, the Muslims from the Nation of Islam was more prominent because they were more controversial. So they got more play in the press than the traditional Muslims did. So they got much more play. And you had, you know, the charismatic leader in Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, or Malcolm X as he was at the time, before he himself transitioned to Orthodox Islam. that made the nation, that built the nation up. The nation was a very powerful social reform movement headed by Elijah Muhammad, and made very popular by Malcolm or Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz. May Allah have mercy on him and grant him Jannah. There were movements that were going side by side here in this part of Zul. Most people are not aware that there were Sunni movement here, the Dar al-Islam and other groups, and the Deen al-Islam, Islamic movement, and groups like this, that existed, that existed here in this part of the world, functioning. Actually, prior to the groups coming in from outside, coming from the Far East, from Middle East and so on, Arabs and Muslims from those other parts of the world coming, the Islam was considered black, so they call it black Muslims. So it was considered black at the time. Talk about late 60s and 70s, very early 70s, but 60s, and all most of the masjids there, on the East Coast actually, were started and run by Muslims of African American background. There were many. They were the dominant groups. Masjids that you had here in this part of the world. And some of them going way back, from across the Middle East. The groups existed, a lot of groups. They had their own print media. You had it's not just only the Muhammad Speaks was part of the nation movement. There was the Muhammad Speaks. But then you had, like Western Sunrise and books and newspapers like this done by other groups, that were published. You got weekly newspapers, Muslim newspapers that were published, back then. In those days, we used to look forward to those papers to keep you up to date on what's happening. Islam, it took the revivalist movement in Islam. It was very, very, very strong. Coming up from the south. So you find that many of the Muslims coming up from the south, after Islam grew back in the 80s, right? Back to the 80s. And you had a lot of Muslims coming like from Guyana and from Trinidad, migrating north. There was a big exodus of Muslims back in the 80s, from 90s, from Guyana and places like this. As you know, Guyana was it was a serious situation going on there at the time with the socialist system that they had. And so there was a mass exodus here. So you had so many Muslims coming and settle in this part of the north, coming from south to north, settling in Florida and in New York area and in Canada, and so you have large communities that is of this background of people settling. So they begin build more masjids. So masajids really start to spring up in these parts of the world from these different groups that there. And many of them, because in my early days after, we started a lot of revival work in Islam in Guyana. So many of those young people who came, that were there, and they moved north and they continued their work here in this part of the world. So they joined, they became part of groups like the MSAs and the ISNA. Actually, one of the brothers from Guyana, he became vice president and in Canada he was one of the vice president of ISNA in North America, from Guyana. That's how prominent they were, and they influenced both movements the Islam and the ICNA also movement. Many people participate in Islamic games, and they did a lot of work that influenced a lot of Islamic development in this part of the world as it grew. So there's Islam is a rich heritage here, as mixture that we need to harness. I don't think that that Muslims in this part of the world really understand how rich their heritage is. We have the Muslims from coming down from the descendants of the slaves, like people like myself who come from the descendants of slaves who came back into Islam, revert back to Islam and so on. We have this rich heritage from the African diaspora, and then you have people coming from the Muslim world per se, Arab or Indo-Pak or Asian coming in, and then you have the Muslims coming from south. Down South America and Caribbean side. So we have and America right now has a very, very rich group that if they were able to come together and understand the heritage and what they each have or the role that they can play, we could have a very dynamic Muslim group, Muslim presence here in North America. I pray that Muslims would really come to such a realization at this time.